Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage co-anchor of CNBC's Squawk Box and founder and editor-at-large New York Times Dealbook, Andrew Ross Sorkin.
Good morning, everybody. It is a privilege for me to be here and to introduce our first panel of the day. We have an extraordinary group to really think through the remarkable transformation going on in the economy globally, the remarkable transformation going on in this economy here. But before we do that, we want to get your thoughts and input on this discussion. We're also going to check to see whether your views of the world are going to change as this discussion evolves. If you have your iPhone with you or an Android and you have the app open, we'd like to introduce a quick poll for everybody to participate in. If you haven't downloaded it, we will try to do this over the course of 90 seconds and hope that that's enough time to allow everybody to participate. So with that, what we'd like to do is to put some questions, or the question of the morning, up on the screen. This is it. What do you anticipate to be the most significant feature of the 21st century? 1, a new global economic order. 2, facing new global challenges. 3, new technological breakthroughs. 4, new businesses and new ways of working. Or 5, a century of peace and prosperity. That's the question. Those are the answers. And we're going to give you probably now about 30 seconds to try to put the information up there. As we do that, let me try to introduce to you what is a remarkable group of brilliant thinkers on the economy and the global stage. And if I could introduce them and have them come to the stage, I would be terribly grateful. Our host is here. Yasser Al-Ramian, His Excellency, please, of course, of the Public Investment Fund, here this morning with us. Christine Lagarde is here from the IMF. Amin Nasser of Saudi Aramco is here this morning. Victor Chu of First Eastern Investment Group is here this morning. Larry Fink of BlackRock is here this morning. And David McCormick of Bridgewater is here this morning. Welcome to you all. Thank you. And as we sit down, I'm going to ask that the answers, to the extent that the poll numbers have been put together, we can see there. Number 3 is the winner of this contest. New technological breakthroughs. Of all of the answers, I should tell everybody here, we're going to have this conversation again in this poll at the end of this discussion, and we will see how it changes. First of all, thank you all for being here. It's a tremendous honor and privilege for us to be here with you this morning. There are so many questions about where the global economy is going, and really whether we are at an inflection point, whether we're really at a major shift between developing and developing countries, and how technology is going to change all of this. With your blessing, Your Excellency, I'm going to begin this conversation not with you, sir, but with Christine Lagarde.
Ladies first, right?
Ladies first. When you think about where we are in the economy today, help us lay a framework, but also help us lay a framework for the new world order, to the extent that you believe that we are at an inflection point. What does it look like?
Well, at the moment, it looks reasonably good and better than it did a few years back. And it's certainly a point where the global economy is growing better, moving from 3.2 to 3.6 and forecasted at 3.7 next year from our account. And with clearly some advanced economies participating a bit more than they had, emerging markets, for some of them coming out of the difficult period that they were in, China continuing its course and using different devices, including its significant balance sheets to move ahead. So we have a situation which is encouraging, where investment is picking up and where growth is not exclusively led in some countries by consumption as it was. But underneath, and you've encouraged me to look ahead and to think sort of 50 years ahead, I think we have some critical decisions to make at the moment if we want that future in 50 years' time to look like utopia rather than dystopia. And those changes are not going to be about demographics, because 50 years' time we know more or less what the situation will be, and we will have this combination of aging societies, including in the emerging market economies, and some very fast-growing economies, still particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So that demographic basis will not change massively. What is needed now is clearly to address two key issues, and that will drive us towards either utopia or dystopia. The first one is climate change. As I've said before, if we don't do anything about climate change now, in 50 years' time we'll be toasted, roasted, and grilled. So decisions are needed at this point in time, which will probably mean that in 50 years' time oil will be a secondary commodity, which is well understood in the kingdom, and I'm delighted about that. The second thing is inequality. And what I mean by inequality is inequality between men and women. Again, the kingdom is doing some good things about it. Inequality between those who have a lot and those who have less or the same as for so many years. And inequalities between countries. If you look at a map at the moment, those countries that will suffer massively from climate change are, surprise, surprise, those countries that are low-income countries at the moment. If we don't address those two issues of climate change and growing inequalities, we will be moving towards a dark 50 years from now. If we do address those issues as of now, it might look a lot better. It will look different. Centers of powers will be different. It might not be the nation state anymore. There might be some large mega cities that will be driving actors. It might be private sector actors who will be also centers of powers. The international order, I hope, for the IMF, will require more coordination, monetary policy that will be of a different caliber and which might have a more universal aspect to it. Cryptocurrencies, maybe, to be seen. I don't want to bet on that. But that new order will certainly change, but will hopefully be rooted in a sense of community, in a sense of culture that is badly needed for us, human beings, individuals that need to relate to a sense of belonging. Right. So that's very broadly brushed. But my key message is, if we don't address those issues now, we might be moving into a much darker scenario that I don't want to depict because I would take too much time and it would be too sad.
Your Excellency, you are in a unique and remarkable position as an investor on behalf of this great country. Help us understand the framework with which you think about investing over the next 50 years, as Christine Lagarde was just talking about, and also speak to the idea of the push and pull between investing for the return on investment, the IRR, and investing for the people, and how you think about that mix.
So we're going to start with three stages. The first one is the National Transformation Plan 2020, which is very short term. And the longer term, we have the Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, which was announced about a year ago. And we started implementing these vision and beyond, which is up to half a century ahead. If you look at the PIF and the way we're looking at the investments, we have four objectives. Number one, of course, to grow our revenue streams and to try to diversify the revenue streams that we have in the country by doing all kinds of investments and take on the challenges of the future that's coming to us. The second thing is to try to, and to your point about the people, localizing the technologies abroad, bringing it to Saudi, And I think with our short-term plans, we would have more than 20,000 jobs in 2020, and beyond it's going to be a lot more. In addition to the ROIs and the return on investments and the other ratios for returns. We would like also to establish some new sectors in Saudi, and we started a lot of announcements in the past 6 months or so in different big projects and different sectors, like in the waste management, in the entertainment and the recreation. And the fourth point, which is very, very important to us, is the partnerships that we're having with the rest of the world. So we've announced in the past 6 months 2 major partnerships between PIF and SoftBank Vision Fund, which is the largest fund in the history of fund raising 100 billion reals, and we have committed to 45% of that, and this is exactly doing the things that we're trying to do in FII, which is looking at the future investment trends and try to be on them, trying to mitigate for what disruptions coming to us. Also, we've announced, I think today we announced with Steve Schwarzman, Blackstone, another conventional investment, because I think the conventional investments will not go away. You need infrastructure, you need medical care, you need education. I know there are going to be some disruptions to them, but sometimes you have to invest in the conventional economy. So we've announced today also another fundraising, and this is going to the mega partnerships that we're doing, a $50 billion fund, and we're committed for 40% of that, which is $20 billion.
Help us with this. It's a very practical question. I know you're trying to think 50 years out, oftentimes with these investments, but you have a lot of money to put to work in quite a short amount of time. The value of assets across the globe has risen remarkably over the last several years. How do you think about that? Meaning, do you say to yourself that where are we in the cycle? Do you even think about the cycle?
PIF is
صندوق الاستثمارات العامة. نحن نهتم بهذه الدائرة، ولكن عندما ننظر خلف الأمور أو من وراء الأمور فيما يتعلق في بحسب رؤية 3020، وأن هذه الدائرة وفيما يتعلق بها دورة الاقتصاد العام والاستثمار في المستوى العالم موجود هذا الأمر، ولكن نحن نعتقد أن نفكر على المدى الأبعد والمدى البعيد أيضا. بالإضافة إلى ذلك فهذه الدائرة هي أعمق من ذلك. إذا نظرنا إلى هؤلاء الناس الأفراد الذين تكلموا على تصحيح المسار في هذا المسار، هذه الدائرة، وإذا نظرنا إلى الأرقام وإذا نظرنا إلى الأداء كل الشركات حول العالم، وليس فقط في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية ولكن حتى إذا ذهبنا إلى الأسواق الناشئة والصاعدة أيضا، سوف أيضا اليوم حوالي 25% نسبتها، وبالتالي فيما يتعلق بالأرقام الاقتصادية التي يمكن أن نراها في هذه الحالة. ولكن حتى مع ذلك نحن حتى إذا رأينا هذه التباطؤ في هذه الدائرة في هذه الدورة، فيمكننا أن
goal for us to invest more, because things will be even looking better and a bit cheaper.
Amin, help us with this. A large part of this conversation and the answer to the poll was about the shift in technology, the great technological shift that so many people expect, one of which is EV, electric vehicles, the shift away from oil and gas. You live oil and gas every day. How should we all think about this?
Thank you, Andrew. We are, you're accurately correct, witnessing transformation. So transformation is underway. But if we look at the history, transformation happened in the past transition period. If you look at biomass and coal to be replaced by crude oil and gas, coal today represent almost 40% in the power sector, while renewable 8%. So coal still ahead of gas after decades, and it will take gas to overcome coal by 2035. So yes, there is transformation. It will take time, but it will take decades for that transformation to happen. Alternatives, electric cars and renewables are definitely gaining market share, making a lot of progress, and we are witnessing that. However, it will be decades before they take a major share of the global energy supply. Let's look at renewable first. Renewable today in the power sector, you're talking about 8%, solar and wind. And renewable impact coal, gas, nuclear, because oil, if you look at the power sector today, represent only 5 to 6%, and it is declining. So renewable does not have an impact on the oil sector. It will have more impact on nuclear, gas, coal. Of course, it will impact electric vehicles, because electric vehicles, they will get their supply from the power generation. But in the oil, which is mainly in transportation, shipping, aviation, chemicals, it will not have an impact. But it will definitely, it's an enormous, if you look at renewables, it's an enormous energy. If you look at the amount of sun generated in 1 hour, more than what the whole world consumes in 1 year. So it is an enormous energy. It will grow, and it will have a lot of good progress in the future, but we need to be realistic. Electric cars, which is, if you look at light vehicles industry, where oil almost contribute 25% of the share in that, of 98 million barrels today, 25% of that go to light vehicles, which is impacted by electric vehicles. So 75% still not impacted, but let's talk about the 25%. Electric cars, the statistic in 2016, 2 million electric vehicles. 700,000 out of the 2 million are hybrid. So they have oil-based engine, 700,000 out of the 2 million. Out of a fleet of about 1.3 billion, 1.2 to 1.3 billion. So 2 million out of 1.3 billion, you're talking about 0.2% of the total fleet is in electric vehicles. If you look at the most bullish scenarios by 2040, you're talking about 530 electric vehicles. This is the most bullish I have read so far by 2040. But the fleet by that time will be 2 billion. So there will be still 1.5 billion almost using conventional engine. I agree also they will be more efficient, but there will be a lot of conventional vehicles using hydrocarbons. So we need also to be realistic about the growth in electric vehicles, even if you double that number. If you go the most bullish scenario that we know, 530, and you double it, still there will be a lot of conventional vehicles in the market. Our industry, when you talk about the hydrocarbons, also need to grow to meet the future demand. If you look at what happened the last 3 years alone, 5 million of demand. 2015, 2016, and 2017, there is almost 5 million barrels of additional demand. If you couple that with the decline that we see in the industry, in existing fields, and if we talk about 98 million barrels per day, the decline is around 5%. So 5 billion barrels per day, the industry needs to bring additional just to meet the natural decline. Add to that the additional demand that we are seeing every year between 1.5 to 1.6 million barrels for the last 2 years, including this year. There is a lot of investment that needs to happen in our industry. So we are not as much worried about new technologies, electric vehicles and renewable. They will continue to grow and we welcome that. Actually, the kingdom is participating big time in renewables. We have 10 gigawatt. The company is looking, Saudi Aramco, to participate in renewables because they think it is a good sector and we should be in it. Not only in the kingdom, also globally. But we need to have the right amount of investment in the hydrocarbon. Let's not forget the drop in price between 2014 and 2015, $100 going to $40 happened because of additional 2 million barrels supply. 2 million barrels of additional supply brought the price by $60. What is happening right now, a lot of talk about electric vehicles and renewables, and there is not much investment going into the hydrocarbon. We're talking about almost $1 trillion. We have been saying that in the past, that is not either deferred or canceled as an investment. That, if it doesn't happen, because our business, our industry require 5 to 7 years of cycles. From exploration to development, 5 to 7 years. $1 trillion, $300 million in exploration, and $700 billion in development, either deferred or canceled. That will have an impact on global energy security of the future if we do not do something about that now.
Right. Thank you for that. We're going to come back and have a longer discussion about that in just a moment. But Victor, give us the view from China, the rise of China and where China 50 years from now is going to be.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm very pleased to be here. 50 years for China is the right, period of time in terms of China's own traditional long-term thinking. For example, the One Belt, One Road project initiated by China is a 100-year program. It has all the hallmarks of what we're talking about here. It's inclusive because it involves, 65 countries plus. It creates jobs. It brings value to frontier economies that can benefit from China's development experience in the last 40 years. Is initiated as a win-win type of situation. It's long-term because mainly is infrastructure projects with a lot of emphasis on green. So in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of sustainability, in terms of impactful investment, it ticks all the boxes. So I think that is a very good example where long-term, medium-term projects could be pioneered and championed by a particular country, but with the help and support and the partnership of the rest, right, where everybody will win. The other thing where China needs to think through is, as Christine said, we're also having a major aging population, and therefore how to look after that particular growing population in terms of what we call big healthcare, big wellness type of industry is important. And that, again, government cannot do it all. You have to do, PPP. And you need to develop a new culture where the younger investor has to buy in that investment are not just for ROI. It has to be for overall return. It has to be responsible. It has to be longer term. And it has to bring value to society. And I think that is going to resonate, with the Chinese population and indeed with the Oriental population, because the family unit is very important in our cultures. The other interesting thing for China is that I think you will see in the next 50 years the shift of the shareholder base from G7 to G20 to emerging markets to the Orient. Now, in this part of the world, in the Oriental world, in the Asian world, in the Chinese world, we think as owners of business. So I also feel that in the future, shareholders will be a lot more active, and therefore the culture from a top down will be gradually shift to more bottom up. And finally, in China, fintech is an important innovation, and I also hope that through fintech we can allow domestic retail young investor to participate in the longer term infrastructure projects. Even for small sum, 50,000, they can participate. Because right now, all these big projects is more corporate institutional. Whereas I think if we can tap into the domestic young people's resonance, I think it will also help. Because we need, 3.8 trillion or thereabout every year for the next 15 years. And no public money or institutional money can do it all.
Right. Larry Fink, thank you for that. Help us understand this. You have spent a lot of time talking about investing for the long term, trying to avoid the short term. I have two questions for you. One is about what type of discipline you think the market provides, given the short term piece of that versus the long term. And also, what do you make of the populism that's taken place all over the world when it comes to investing today?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. And Yasser, thank you for having me today. It's great to be back in the kingdom. I think most human beings are frightened to think about the long term. I think it's natural for most people to focus on the moment and maybe a very short time horizon. And the difficulty we have now, and it's getting even greater and greater, as we are living longer, which means we're going to be working 40 to 50 years, in most cases 50 years now. And so when you think about a 40 or 50 year time horizon before retirement, the need for savings towards that retirement is just greater and greater. And this is one of the great fundamental problems we have in the world today. And so you're correct in asking about time horizons. And unfortunately, time horizons are way too short. But if you just think about the 80% of people's savings beyond the day-to-day needs and saving for emergencies is really only for a few functions. One, to buy a house. Two, to have enough money to maybe help your children. But most importantly, number one component of savings is savings to live in retirement and dignity. That's a 40, 50-year obligation, and it requires investing towards that goal, that objective. And that requires investing in most asset cases, equities. And unfortunately, we have witnessed a transformation towards more short-termism, and it's actually accelerating. And I believe the greatest problem we have in the developed world, and it may become a great problem in the developing world, is the inability of savings towards retirement. What we have witnessed over the last 40 years is a transformation away from defined benefit plans to defined contribution, which is having a huge impact because the individual is now responsible for their retirement, not the company. And this is changing very dramatically. And when you have your own responsibility in a defined contribution plan, you are at times frightened of the movements of the world, and you change your investment horizon. The key is trying to evolve investment horizons towards the long run. And now when you talk about populism, I think populism is actually going to grow and grow. And it was interesting to see how the audience chose how technology is going to change the world. But technology is going to create actually more populism. Because technology is going to help many. But let's be clear, what technology will mean is less human input in the manufacturing of items. So we're going to actually have capital, and those who have capital are going to be the huge beneficiaries. Those who are keeping their money in the short run, like in Germany, 72% of all savings is in cash. In Japan, there's $5 trillion of individual savings in bank accounts. So they don't even participate in the rally of these markets. And I think when we complete this year, if the markets stay where they are, up 20+%, you're going to have some very big wins for a small component of society, and the majority of society is going to be left behind. The gap between the wealth or the wealthy and the majority of the population is actually going to increase. And so, and now, because this is the other major problem, because I think democracies are having even a more difficult time about focusing on the long term. They're focusing on more and more of the short-termism. You're seeing less what I would call structural long-termism out of government. And so this is all playing into this vicious cycle, and this vicious cycle is now being illuminated through this populism. So it is my fear this populism is going to grow, it's going to get harder, and I'm not looking forward government to help us out, but it's going to have to be corporations worldwide in making a difference, and it's going to be those companies that are focusing on these issues, trying to alleviate some of this, these problems, or we're going to have much greater problems. It's not going to be idealistic as we think. We may have this great technology that we're all going to enjoy, but we're going to see greater populism, which may translate into major unrest. And so I don't want to sound grim, but I do believe we're living in an incredible moment in time where there's vast wealth creation, but with that is going to create more inequalities. And then my greatest fear is, as we think about the development of the emerging world, the emerging world that has an economy based on education, they'll do fine. China is going to do great. The emerging economies that are still based on cheap human labor or some commodities, they're going to be left behind. And so we're going to have a even greater disjointed world than we've witnessed in some time. And we're all going to have to play a bigger role in trying to equalize the world.
Right. David McCormick of Bridgewater, pick up on that idea. Your founder, Ray Dalio, has talked about artificial intelligence changing the investment landscape, even how you invest. Thinking about what Larry was just talking about, thinking about the potential for what that populism may ultimately turn into, what do you do about it?
Well, let me try to sort of step back from it and tie together a couple of things that were already said in answering your question. First, sort of as Christine said, the global economy right now looks very healthy, and there's lots of things to feel good about. Most major economies are growing. But the most significant thing in the near-term horizon that will affect most of the investors in this room and most policymakers is how the global economy makes the transition from all the major central banks being in a period of prolonged easing to tightening. And if you think about the enormous amount of monetary stimulus that's come through both interest rates and quantitative easing, that's now going to happen in reverse, and how that is handled will have enormous implications for how assets perform. It'll have enormous implications for populism and a number of other things. In the medium term, there's a number of challenges that were mentioned here that affect particularly the developed economies, but in those cases, there's also lessons, I think, for the developing world, the emerging economies. And the first is the enormous amount of debt, the IOUs, without income sufficient to pay off those IOUs. Those IOUs come in the form of healthcare benefits, in pensions, in infrastructure deficits. These economies are unlikely to be able to meet those obligations, particularly if you believe that assets will perform at a much lower return going forward than they have historically in the last 8 or 10 years, which has been one of the greatest periods for assets in the last 100 years. So that's a first big challenge, and that has led to and exacerbated the second thing, which is an enormous amount of income inequality. So that income inequality, we've had stagnant incomes in the developed world, the United States and others, for the last 30 years. That wealth gap has grown because those that have held assets have benefited from the run-up in assets and everyone else has not. And so that gap has dramatically increased, which has fed into the third area, which is populism, as Larry talks about. And I think that populism is so important to pause on for a minute, because it really potentially challenges the formula which the globe has benefited from over the last 30 or 40 years. If you think about populism being essentially about the system not working for a big part of the population and rewriting the rules, there's enormous implications for that, for free trade, for open investment. And the challenge will be to address those issues in a way that ultimately doesn't kill the goose that laid the golden egg in terms of the global economy, but addresses these inequities. And the rise of technology, artificial intelligence, the new transparency we all see in our everyday lives, has the possibility of greatly exacerbating that challenge, because the technology can further divide the haves and the have-nots. This weekend I went to buy a new iPhone for one of my kids. It was $800. There is 75% of the population, 60% of the population in the United States that doesn't have a discretionary $800 for an iPhone. So this can be a very, very big challenge. It can also be, and I'll stop here, it can also be part of the answer in that technology and social networks and the ability to engage a broader community can be part of the path back to re-engaging those parts of our society that have become disaffected.
Christine, help us with this. Given what Larry talked about education, given this rise of populism, and given the rise perhaps of technology, when you think about the emerging markets that you think about every day, is education the only answer? Because it's just as likely that we could have a lot of people who are quite educated, but the technology will ultimately be smarter than us.
You know, I don't think it's the only answer, but it's a very important part of the answer. I think the other one is health. You know, there are major health issues, particularly applying to the low-income countries, that need to be addressed, because those low-income countries where population is growing fast, which will be the primary victim of climate change impact, have youth that are looking for inserting themselves into society, using possibly new technologies, which they master much faster than you know, older citizens like me, or maybe all of you, and they need help to get there, and they need, you know, their brain to develop, their body to develop, and health issues are at the core of this development. So it's education, but it's health as well, as Victor mentioned. In terms of education, I think we need to just pause for a second, because it has a huge impact on the future of work. And this is something that we have not really touched on in depth. If we look into the future, decades from now, what the future of work will be is a huge, big question mark. Will it be in the same relationships as we have it now? Will it be based on the same kind of skills that we are developing with our children or grandchildren as we do now? When you hear that, you know, about 2/3 of the children in school today will have jobs that need to be invented, it really poses the question of what is that education offer that we need to frame and constantly improve upon. Our certainty at the IMF is that education is not going to be a stage in one's life, as it used to be the case. It will be a long cycle during the entire life that will have to be applied in order to help people who will work for 50 years, as Larry indicated, adjust to those new technologies and those changes that are impacting the job market, the product and services market. And that is how education has to be framed. We also need to factor into this the combination of, as David mentioned, the combination of those new technologies compounded, not just artificial intelligence, but all of it coming together and actually changing the job market, changing the way in which manufacturing is taking place, not necessarily entirely replacing human beings, which would require some kind of universal basic income, as the kingdom here is thinking about. But it will be a massive assistance to probably to be invented jobs of the future. Right. So education is absolutely crucial for the development of those countries, and not just those countries that are low income or possibly emerging, but all countries, including the advanced economies.
Your Excellency, help us with this. She just mentioned universal income. I know you think a lot about inequality, and you think a lot about this grand experiment and transition in this country. What do you think it's going to look like here in 50 years?
Again, I'm going to start with the Vision 2030. That's our target for now. And we set all the objectives and the targets that we want to have. So PIF and being a main enabler for the Vision 2030 is looking at diversifying the economy, looking at creating new sectors, and bringing in new jobs. And in addition to that, just to pick in the earlier point, bring in some of the technologies abroad to localize it in Saudi. And with that, you would have an improvement to the not only to the number of jobs, but to the quality of these jobs. So the equality between genders, and that's one of the main things that we're looking at. Enabling women to the workplaces to work and to have all the other rights. So the future, and basically that's what we want to discuss here. I mean, this is the first session, but we have the next 3 days to hear from everybody. We have 3,500 people coming in from 60 different countries to discuss these things. I mean, I hear the views from Christine and from the others about, you know, education, health, investment, but I mean, it's different perspectives, and everybody is bringing something from their own perspective. I think investing in the education, investing in the healthcare, investing in the artificial intelligence, investing in robotics, investing in life science, which is very, very important to us, the Internet of Things. The world is changing, and I think it's better for us not to sit around and wait for it to change and us being distracted about what's going on. I think for us as the PIF, and that's what I can talk about right now, is we want to be part of this change. We want to invest in this change.
Okay, while I have you here, because it is the elephant in the room, I'm going to ask. There's been a lot of speculation about this Aramco IPO, and the proceeds of that IPO will fund in large part a big portion of the type of investments that you may very well be making over the next many years. Where are we with this IPO? Is it on track? Is it not on track? Depending on who you read, you hear all sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, we have a better guy. I mean, can answer this, but I can tell you that we are on track. I mean, we have His Excellency Khalid Al-Falih, the Minister of Energy, with us today. We have Amin. I'm in the board of Aramco. Everything is on track. 2018 is our target. There is nothing that I know about which can take us off track.
And just to put a fine point on it, when we hear that other investors might invest, like the Chinese, and that could either delay things or take it off the table, is that right?
No.
It's not right.
No. That's not right. Definitely not right. I mean, we are on track. That's what I can say. And that's part of the diversity of what we want to do in PIF, which is, taking these proceeds and, some would say, which is very absurd to me, that we are going only to the future investments. If you look at our assets under management today, it's all in conventional investments. And we don't want to be like a sitting duck waiting to be, shut down or by only being in the conventional investments. We want to go beyond. That's what Vision 2030 is all about. Go to the future, try to take command of the future. So we're not selling out all of our conventional investments. We're going to be there. We're going to continue on and I mentioned earlier with Blackstone, we're going in infrastructure, which doesn't get any more conventional than this. Right. And that's, it's a big amount, but we would like to be part of the future and part of the change.
Right. Tell us also, while we have you here, Masa-san is here, and you mentioned it earlier, you're making a massive investment with SoftBank into the future of technology. How did that investment come about? And how do you think about putting that amount of money to work effectively in a very quick period in this world of technology, which is changing so fast?
Two things. Masa-san is no more in the room. I think he left. Oh. And I think we have some other guests, so you can ask questions. But I'll just, in 30 seconds. That's, the vision, the SoftBank Vision Fund is talking about the four things that I just mentioned earlier, which is artificial intelligence, robotics, Internet of Things, and life science. And I think these are the future trends. Right. The Internet of Things, you have chips and everything is talking to everything. And you have all of kind of big data that needs to be analyzed for a better position for us as investors, as corporations. And I think we will continue on these kind of investments in addition to the ones that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, I will pivot away from you. I'm going to go to Victor. I want to know this, Victor. China has been one of the great growth engines of the world. What is a realistic growth rate, GDP growth rate for China over the next decade? And there are a lot of investors in this room, and the answer matters a lot.
Well, in the short term, I think China can still grow as it has been, between 6 and 7%. But you must understand that the cake is much bigger today. So we can't look at the growth rate average for the last 30 years and say the next 30 years, China will still be growing at the 7, 8, 9%, because that would not be realistic. And also, China is also evolving from growing for just growth's sake to more quality recurrent growth. I think the pronouncement that we have heard in the last few days is very encouraging. China is going for a much cleaner system, a greener system, and it's going to be a more engaged partner to the world. I think I'm, as an investor in China for the last 30 years, I'm very encouraged. I think China will still grow at a reasonably high rate, but as I said, they are evolving. They're looking for quality, recurrent growth, relying on innovation and also efficiency.
Right. Larry, you always talk about pensioners. What do you think the expected rate of return should be for your investors these days? What's possible and what's realistic?
The BlackRock Investor Institute came out with a 10-year forecast of 4%.
4%?
That's, yeah. That was with a balanced portfolio. That's how low it is. Now, I tend to think it's going to be probably closer to 6%, but it's not going to be what we saw 8 or 10 or 12% anymore. I'm talking about a balanced portfolio for a pension fund. We are in a world of low inflation. We are going to see some societies moving from a consumption-oriented society to, or to a saving society to more of a consumption society. And so you're going to see some changes there. But long-term growth rates are decelerating quite rapidly. And this is going to present pension funds with bigger issues, bigger liability issues. But this is also one of the reasons why we have to address this issue of retirement today with low expected returns, whether it's 4, 6, or 8. It's probably never going to be 8 now, because 8 was the last 10 years. It means you have to put money away sooner to get to the expected pool of money you want during retirement. And so it is, it will be a very large challenge for companies and their pension funds, for individuals, and more importantly, it's probably going to be the deciding problem of democracies of dealing with this with their population. And I don't believe most democracies are prepared. Australia is prepared and getting more prepared. Other societies that have really strong pension funds that are mandatory, they're not. It's not a volunteer program. It is a mandatory program, and it's a program actually based on long-termism and investing in equities. But most countries don't have what I would call the proper forward retirement system to meet the needs of their population.
Right. David, what's your targeted rate of return these days?
I would have said almost the exact same thing as Larry. So in other words, a balanced portfolio would be 3%, 4%.
3 or 4% only.
Which, as he said, has huge implications for the social strains because of those unfunded obligations that I mentioned earlier. So this isn't a near-term challenge. It's not an immediate crisis, but it's something that, from a midterm sort of perspective, will be a very ominous set of challenges for policymakers to face.
Your Excellency, when investors, some of whom are in this room, come to you with a new fund or a new project, what is your target rate of return?
I mean, it differs from, because we have 6 different portfolios. So we have the international portfolio, we have the international partnerships, something like what we're doing with Masa and Steve. We have the sector development in Saudi, we have the real estate and infrastructure, we have the mega projects, and we have the Saudi equities. So each one of these portfolios would have its own target return. Eventually, in 2030, we benchmark ourselves, right? We went to all the endowments, we went to all the sovereign wealth funds, the long-term investors. And the numbers varies between 3% to about 9%, and the outliers will be in the low teens. And when we looked at the efficient frontier with the returns and the risks, because you have to control both if you want to have more returns than to have a balanced portfolio. So we're targeting between 8 to 9%, but that's in 2025 to 2030.
8 to 9% on average in total?
Yes.
Across the board. Christine Lagarde.
Yeah, Andrew, if I may comment on that, because I think it's a really important point. If our forecast is right, that 3.7% is the average global growth next year and hopefully later, that really takes us back to the average growth that we had experienced prior to the Great Recession, the financial crisis of 2008. So we're sort of back to those days when return on assets was significantly higher, which brought about this skewed distribution of wealth and possibly income that we were talking about earlier on, and which is a real threat to democracy, to stability, and to wise investment that relies very much on that stability and macroeconomic framework. So to have a return of 4% is quite reassuring, actually, when we hear Larry and David, because it means that those asset valuation will move up teeny tiny bit higher than growth, but will not be contributing to the massive disruption that we have seen in the last decades before the financial crisis and post-financial crisis for that matter. So I think we should all be encouraging that, those sensible targets which will not be causing massive disruption going forward. If we believe in stability, if we believe in democracy, and if we believe in eventually the happiness of human beings.
Right. I want to try to leave us on a somewhat optimistic note. Amina, here's what I want to talk about with you, if you could. We got to spend some time together, and you're working on some remarkable technology. People think of you as an oil and gas company, but there's a technological piece to this that might change. A lot of people talking about electric vehicles. You're doing a lot of other things. Give us a little bit of a sense of that.
Thank you, Andrew, and I'm glad you visited the company for the last 2 days. Yes, of course, technology is very important for the company, not only to optimize our cost, increase our discovery and recovery, but we do a lot on that. We have the highest recovery in the industry, mainly because of utilizing the latest technology in terms of modeling. We have terahours in terms of simulating and modeling our mega reservoirs. That allows us to place our wells right, maximize the production from all of these wells, and also optimize our cost. Our cost today is the lowest in the industry. We have the highest recovery also in the industry, even compared to our neighbors and globally with the best. It's all because of technologies, placing the technologies in terms of either modeling, in terms of smart water, in terms of robotics, in terms of basin simulator that will allow us to do better exploration. Technology is started with the company a long time ago. That's why we have 3 centers in the kingdom, right. 8 centers globally. Each center is positioned in a certain place where we can add value to Saudi Aramco. We train, we develop our people, we send them to business schools, we give them their best assignments, and we focus on technology for the long term. But technology is not only to optimize cost, and this is very important. We are looking at technology today. How can we reduce carbon emission for the future? How can we have cars? 2 of our centers globally is designed to produce engines that is more efficient, that will have less carbon emissions. How can we collect CO2 from mobile sources, from cars? And we have demonstration project to show that we can collect CO2 from mobile sources. How can we turn CO2 to useful product, polyurethane, and utilize it? So there is a lot of technology that is addressing the future. What is it that we need to do today to be prepared for a future where carbon emission is a major issue? It is putting a lot of pressure on the industry, and the industry is reacting today by making the right investment to prepare the industry for the future. I just want to say a little bit about Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is also 10 companies. Some of my colleagues are here. An investment of also $1 billion through a climate investment fund that is also focusing on technology to reduce carbon emissions. So the industry is cognizant of the need to manage carbon emission, doing a lot today to prepare for the future, because we would like to be more competitive with electric cars and with renewables in the future. And that is very important for our industry.
Okay, as we wrap up, I have a final question for Your Excellency. We're going to have a remarkable number of conversations over the next several days. I'm curious, as you were setting this up, what is the one thing that you want to know when this is all over?
The future investments, that's the whole thing. I mean, we would like to understand more, to have more partnerships, to have better investment opportunities. This is the whole thing. We have people coming from 60 different countries, about 2,000 of them and 1,000 plus from Saudi. We would like to make this as an annual event, and it's going to be empowered by us, by the PIF. And we want to have discussions for the disruptions that are coming to us. We want to mitigate, because we just can't sit around. We just can't wait for things to be put on us without any fight back. This is our way of trying to mitigate for the future.
Okay. Your Excellency, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. To all the panelists, thank you for helping kick off this morning. We appreciate it very, very, very much. Thank you. Now, before we go, we want to ask the same question that we asked of you about an hour ago on your app. If you have an app with you, we're going to put that poll question back up on the screen for a moment. You're going to see it there. And we're going to give you about 30 seconds to input your new answer. And we're going to see whether or not that has changed. As we all wait, and here is your answers. Number 3 wins, but now by a much, well, I would say much, a marginally wider margin. Anyway, thank you all for the panel. Thank you all for participating. We appreciate it.